and in fact, this talk right now was inspired by the survey last year, where for the first time, we hadn't had this before, but the last year's participants said, well, there's a lot of kind of self-congratulation here, and how about a little bit more critique? So I liked that critique, so I congratulate your predecessors on advancing this critique, and then so I thought, well, okay, what isn't world literature, and what might it? How might we advance the discussion today? Because of course these thoughts have been in the air for a decade and a half anyway, 20 years, depending how far you count, and now there's been a good deal of counter discourse starting to be generated that itself is very, very interesting. So what isn't world literature? I'll say three things that it isn't in particular, then focus on three particular categories of critique that we've been seeing in recent years, and then with some response to that, and then three critiques I myself would offer that I haven't seen enough of yet. What the three things world literature isn't is, for one thing, it isn't what is world literature anymore. Been there, done that, fine, but that was over a dozen years ago. It isn't even our adored friend Franco Moretti's conjectures on world literature, going back to 2000, again, it's a decade and a half, nor is it even the wonderful Pascal Casanova's République mondiale des lettres, again going back to the turn of the millennium. And it's slightly distressing to see how often critiques of the field talk as though that's the last thing that, these works are the last thing that happened 15 years ago, and people are just not reading anything in the last decade or 12 years, which you will be doing, we will be doing together. And of course, if we're thinking what is world literature, what isn't it, it is still a very crowded field and very hard to figure out what it is. This is this wonderful 2006 mural, vast mural by these three Taiwanese artists, Dai Dudu, Li Tieji, and Zhang An, called Discussing the Divine Comedy with Dante. And so you'll see them in the upper corner there, the three artists plus Dante. The one to the most right is looking out, I think, imitating a figure from M.C. Escher, who's looking at one of those Escher towers. And then the conjunction are extremely strange. Stalin is next to Da Vinci. Steven Spielberg is next to Picasso, who's next to Abraham Lincoln, who's next to Mao Zedong. At the bottom, we have Lewis Carroll next to Shirley Temple, which is sort of intriguing. Early kiddie porn, I suppose. We have, in the Chinese side, we have at this table here the drunken figure leaning back as Li Bai, drunk as always, while Tolstoy plays the accordion to accompany him at the table in the middle. And down in the bottom we see, for example, the Dowager Empress Gigi, or just to the right in the middle, in between Salvador Dali and Ariel Sharon. So, what is this? What isn't it? And how is this, how much of this is world literature? We have also Einstein. You can pick out all your favorite figures. So one thing that world literature isn't is one thing. For all the interest in world systems theory, literature resists systematicity in many ways, or at least that's one particular polemic that I have on this. It's not one world literature. It differs in different countries. I'm thinking, for example, of a couple of anthologies. There are Longman anthology that Bruce is here and a number of us edited. It's quite different from the anthology that's just coming out now from Beijing University Press in 10 volumes that I co-edited with my friend Chen Yongguo from Tsinghua. It's somewhat derived from it, but the table of context changed for what they wanted. They wanted, for example, more American and more French literature than we had in the Longman. And I also pressed them to have Vietnamese literature, which they had never had in a Chinese world literature anthology before. So it's an evolving world of world literature that differs from one country to another. Every situation is different. Every national and local situation has a different world literature. Even a given country can have more than one world literature. Here are two recent books that just came out in the last couple of years. Very different. Milestones of World Literature, edited by Dieter Lanping, a very nice handbook, which is really European. It's still European literature. It's Weltliteratur, more European than it was even for Goethe. And you'll notice it's up in the clouds. It's a very interesting representation. And then on the other hand, Siegfried Löffler, die neue Weltliteratur, by God, but still ihre großen Erzähler. They're great authors, are great storytellers. And the neue Weltliteratur, as you see, it's a kind of some third world, perhaps Indian or Pakistani, pile of books in a shop, and her emphasis is on immigrants and post-colonial post-colonial globality. Very contemporary. The new world literature is not just contemporary, but it's this kind of contemporary world literature. So even in Germany, two of the most ambitious recent books are two very different world literatures, just in that one country where the term Weltliteratur was first coined, a little before Goethe's time. So in trying to figure out what world literature is and isn't, I want to discuss in particular three kinds of critique from the past several years, which really come from three directions. From the direction of national philology, national literatures, who tend to emphasize the need for much better cultural and linguistic grounding than the less good kinds of world literature do. And this is a real issue. We have to take very seriously. How on earth do we ground such a variety of material? Do we access it as scholars pedagogically? We have also the critique, especially coming from comparative literature departments, that world literature is not theorized sufficiently. It's just kind of collecting a huge mass of texts and reading them, not enough tough theorization. Often we get people of a deconstructive or Heideggerian mode, thinking we're not thinking hard enough about what is the world, what is language. The question of translation theory is not sufficiently theorized according to these critics. Translatability is taken as a given. So we have Emily Apter and others talking about untranslatability and the need to theorize language differently. And thirdly, the other major strand that we see a lot of comes from post-colonial studies, in particular with the emphasis on a need for a much harder political edge, and a concern that goes back already to Gayatri Spivak's book Death of a Discipline, also in the early 2000s, that world literature is just becoming a new mode of neoliberal globalization, Americanization, writ large and spread thin around the world. So I think all of these are really important critiques that we need to take very, very seriously, even if the rather exaggerated polemics in which they are advanced are not always that helpful in themselves. And it's also, I think, important to note that these critiques all have roots in the 19th century, when people are first starting to think in an organized way about comparative and world literature. All the major lines of critique are already established 150 years ago. For example, the critique from national philology is first expressed in the very first book in English with the title Comparative Literature by Hutchinson Macaulay Posnet, published in London in 1886. And Posnet was trained as a classicist, but was also kind of a public intellectual. He worked as a barrister in Dublin. And he was kind of an autodidact. He spent 10 years working on this book, which was published in the International Scientific Series, as you can see. It's why I give a picture of the cover, along with works on volcanoes, psychology, evolution, and jellyfish, among many other subjects. And indeed, perhaps, so Margaret will be happy, literature of the sea, already the jellyfish. And possibly the amorphous quality of world literature of the sea is there. And he has an evolutionary scientific view of how literature works. Proto-Moretti, events of Moretti himself. And he sees literature as a social phenomenon. So it's both social and formalistic at one and the same time. And literature evolves from smaller units, earlier primitive units to later ones. You have the clan, you have the polis, you have the nation, you have the world. But what's really, and he has a chapter on world literature. And this is, I think, the first important discussion of world literature in English from a sort of academic scholarly point of view, 1886. But interestingly, the world literature chapter is not the final process of the unfolding of literature, which is the nation. He's a good 19th century guy. He understands the nation is where the world is at. So where does world literature happen? It happens in Hellenistic times, in ancient Rome, and with the rise of world religions, not even just in one place, but with the rise of Islam, with the rise of global Christianity, but also so religious or imperial settings. And the problem is, then that with the expansion of the world into world literature, whether from a religious base or from the imperial base, the writer loses the organic connection to a community that the writers always had in the clan, the polis, or will again recover in the nation. So it's a really mixed blessing. It does expand, he says, there's greater individualism in imperial world literature, Hellenistic world literature, and that's his major example, is the Hellenistic and Roman imperial world. But it's a high price. He says the leading mark of world literature is the severance of literature from defined social groups, the universalizing of literature, if we may use such an expression. Such a process may be observed in the Alexandrian Roman, later Hebrew and Arab, the Indian and Chinese literatures. It's amazing, so it's we see already a certain doubleness, because he thinks world literature is one not that happy stage of literary evolution. On the other hand, his is a work of world literary scholarship of really global proportions. He's always looking around the globe, largely in translation. But the results in the world literature as literary production aren't so good. He says this universalism is alike in the East and West, accompanied by the imitation of literary work of earlier, more creative ages, when writers really belong to an organic community. You have scholarship arises with the decay of language. He's thinking of Hellenistic Alexandria. And literary criticism flourishes. Literary criticism is a sign of decadence, we should be aware, as it will be for Nietzsche also, roughly the same time. And it's not really good at deep human feeling. He says the most characteristic genre of this early world literature is satire. It's good at satire. Comedy, entertainment, but not at such serious, where you can't do romantic poetry. You will not have a national romantic poet in the Hellenistic age, or even he thinks in sort of later Islam or China. He just doesn't see it in these worlds. So apparently, long before there was airport literature, there was like trireme literature. And I picked this particular trireme because it's a Roman trireme with an Egyptian crocodile coming out of the water at it. And what you're reading on this boat is probably the Golden Ass of Apuleius, in which you turn into a donkey and then convert to the worship of Isis at the end of the book. This is the kind of satirical thing that is the best you could do. Now, with this critique, I think it's actually really interesting, because it's very important, I'll come back to this, that he sees that world literature is not what Goethe thought it was. Something is of the future in the 19th century. It's going to happen, that maybe is happening now with globalization. He sees it as an early imperial phenomenon and a mixed blessing, because empires are a mixed blessing. Very interesting, Posnet is writing in Dublin. As the book is in press, he's on his way to Auckland, New Zealand, to take up the first chair in comparative literature in New Zealand. So he's writing between the inner and the outer margins of the British Empire and thinking about the mixed blessing of empire. And with this in mind, we can actually go back to Apuleius. And I think it's quite interesting to think about this Hellenistic imperial world literature. Here we have the Penguin Classic with a Pompeii fresco. Here we have a Roman, Egyptian, Roman citizen being carried into the afterlife by Osiris and Thoth, and he's holding a scroll in his hands, probably the Book of the Dead, to guide him into the afterlife. And so this is this weird world literature. He's not we ain't in Kansas anymore, Toto. We're not in Rome here at all, and yet in some way we're in this new world. And I think it's interesting to now look back at Apuleius from this point of view and think, all right, this is really world literature. So Apuleius is born outside Carthage in North Africa, in a probably Punic-speaking region, and he's writing The Golden Ass in Rome for a Roman audience, but he does it by playing on the cultural capital of having been educated in Greece. And he says his Latin is so bad because his Greek is so good, which is an implicit, of course, way of establishing himself for a Roman audience, because he's really got the goods that they want. And already he's raising the very issues that we'll find also in Franco Moretti, if you look at his conjectures or other essays in the distant reading now, that the imperial situation provides a challenge to language, as Posnet's already saying, also a shaking up of genre. It's a dislocating of genre. You're not quite sure what you're dealing with anymore. So if you look at his prologue, He says, I'd like to string together various tales in the Milesian style. Now delight your well-inclined ears, little look towards we are virtual golden asses ourselves, with witty whispers, provided you're willing to peruse this Egyptian papyrus, inscribed with a reed from the Nile. So his cultural authority is double. That he's African, he has a connection to Egypt, which is where we get our papyrus. He's got something of the magical quality of Egyptian, but he's also, even yet, he's an Egypto-Greek. At Athens, I served my first campaigns with the Greek tongue. So it's already using military language. He's conquering, in fact, this language, right? Later in Rome, fresh to come to Latin studies, I assumed and cultivated the native language. We are now natives with a less cultured language than Greek, right? We Roman readers. I beg your indulgence in advance if as a crude performer in the exotic speech of the forum, and I think it's the most radical statement, right? Exotici ac forensis sermonis rudis locutor offendero. He is exoticizing Latin. The imperial language is the exotic language, right? That he can't speak well enough, not just because he's from Punic, but because his Greek is really what's going through his head, right? And he then sort of makes double good on this. The very fact of a change of voice will answer like a circus rider's skill when needed. We're about to begin a Greek-ish tale, fabulam Graecanicam. It's not a Greek tale, it's a Greek-ish tale, which is also outdoing the Greeks, in fact. And if you look at what he's done to the earlier metamorphoses of Pseudo-Lucian, it's like amazing how he's transformed. So it is a translation. It is also a globalization of this circus rider who jumps from the horse of one language to another with this incredible facility, ending his prologue, Lecto intende laetaberis. You will find delight. So already Apelles' prologue raises all of these issues that Posnet raises, that we can now see them more positively than at Posnet's age. As a good classicist, you never liked the late period. It was always the decadent kind of thing. Now we can see a different strategy there. Now this cultural critique of world literature is doubled from within the national philologies, especially by the linguistic critique. That the world literature exists only in translation or too dependent on translation and is not really worth pursuing, or you lose the very essence of what's worth talking about in translation. Or if you use it at all, you do it so naively, you assume we can just translate everything. And we now need to think rather about the problem of untranslatability, which becomes Emily Apter's great theme, in particular the politics of untranslatability. So it's not only the linguistics and literary history of an earlier generation of comparators, but the politics of untranslatability. And these Jules Verne-esque worlds here are actually very appropriate, because on the one hand, it's all the world. On the other hand, it's still very French. And Emily's work is remarkably, like Pascal Casanova's, remarkably Franco-centric, and Franco not in the Moretti sense, but in the geographical sense. Now, I want to say about this that I take very seriously this critique, and I think not only we should embrace it, but that all serious people working today in translation studies are thinking about Paul, Rainer Melartz, who'll be here in the second half, Litar Levy, who's here in this first half, thinking deeply about the thorniness of language, the problem of translation, interlinguality, the politics of what language you're using when, the language anxiety that Robert Young talks about. All of these things are deeply now what we are talking about. I think there was a certain strategic value in the early 2000s to talk about translatability, to emphasize that the pendulum was rather on that side. A number of us were putting it on that side. I think in reaction against the self-confining monolingualism of a lot of post-colonial studies, trilingualism of comparative literature. When I started in graduate school in 1975, on entrance you were supposed to take 3 exams, French, German, and Latin. That was it. You were supposed to know those from your prep school. You were supposed to come and know that. You had to get permission to do any other language. And those were the ones you should probably need to know. And I think, so there are 2 ways to deal with that. One of which is to learn all the languages in the world. I've tried that and failed mightily. The other which is use translation, in fact, right? But we have to, so, and I think, but there was a real point of saying, look, we can use translation, we can use translations intelligently, and it meant building bridges with translation theory, translation studies, which had never, there were never courses in translation theory in comparative literature departments, because you're not supposed to use them. You're not supposed to admit it if you did use them. So why would you study translation as a field? Which meant you only did it badly, not well, or as a kind of higher amateur. So I think it's a very exciting time for thinking about untranslatability and translation. And the best work today does this. I think you'll see all the people on our faculty today are working very extensively in a relatively restricted number of languages that they know really well, cultural context, and then also using translation, also thinking about those things, what Bruce Robbins calls a kind of a grounded cosmopolitanism. It's not a rootless cosmopolitanism at all that we're seeing in all the good work in the field. And indeed, you can have really valuable world literature work done with a single global language. Rebecca Walkowitz's brilliant new book, Born Translated, would be an example of that. Jing Su's books that work on Sinophone. There's a bunch of these now studies. I wrote one whole book on Myth of Gilgamesh as it travels, just on one book, though across several languages and millennia. So there are all kinds of ways you can do this in a linguistically grounded way, even as using translation critically and even metacritically. Just to press a little bit on Emily's book, it's odd to see her sticking to the Francophone, Anglophone sphere of her upbringing. I think that you see sometimes a certain kind of holding action. She somehow still wants comp lit to be what she grew up with some Gayatri added, and then it's fine. And if you look at her use of translation theory, it's Gayatri on Benjamin it's Gayatri on Derrida on Benjamin, and then it's Benjamin on Derrida on Gayatri, and that's sort of what it is. And she just has no time for the cultural turn of translation studies, pioneered by Susan Baston, André Lefebvre, the hermeneutic approach pioneered by George Steiner and Larry Venuti. It's just ruled out of court from the beginning. So that one of my themes for what literature should be is pluralistic. It should not be monological, whether in terms of the theory, whether in terms of the literature, whether in terms of the languages. And even, of course, a good use of a global language will not be monologic or even strictly monolingual in a simple sense. Down that. And I think that the cultural grounding, cultural linguistic grounding is always really important. And thinking about globalization involves theorizing the world differently. And I think with Emily's book, theorizing means a particular strand, really Heideggerian, Derridian theory, and a kind of older French continental philosophical tradition. And she simply rules out of court the whole more sociological theorizing the world that, say, Franco's doing. Gilles Sapiro, who will be here in the second half, a leading exponent of this. And I think Margaret Cohen's work is really theorizing the worlds. What does it mean to think from the perspective of oceans, for example, versus land masses? This is a different theorizing the world, geographically, sociologically, culturally. Our assistant director, Delia Ungarano, has just completed a brilliant new book called From Paris to Tlön on the globalization of surrealism through network theory, closely involved with actual languages and literatures. It's a whole new kind of way of doing these things. So the third level of critique, coming especially from postcolonial studies, tends to be the political. We think of Death of a Discipline, or the combined and uneven development, which I'll give as an example, by the Warwick Research Collective, headed by Neil Lazarus and Benita Perry in Warwick. This just came out last year. Peng Chia has just published his book, What is a World? And a characteristic of these is a very strong political emphasis and a very heartfelt and well-taken concern that we should not allow the study of literature, either in national literature or world literature, to be just a kind of a veneer of neoliberal one-worldism, feeling good about ourselves and the world and our ability to consume whatever we like from whatever place we import it. There are different versions of this critique in all in all three. And often, so I think also the best work is doing this, is strongly politically grounded, is really thinking politically. My particular polemic that I offer to you is that also the politics of the field as a whole can be pluralistic without losing its edge. A given person need not be always pluralistic, but the field ought to be able to be. And when I feel impatient with some of these critiques, it's because they're trying to say my politics is the only politics that matter. And I think the world is so various. Why should that be? So in all of these works, for example, as in Emily's, you will not find the word liberal. You have neoliberal, which means conservative. And you have right-thinking Marxist, leftist. You know, so in some cases, like with the work people, I mean, Franco Moretti is not far enough left to them. Said, they're a little bit condescending. He's okay, but you really have to be to the left of Said, even to be in the conversation, I think, with the combined and uneven development, who build very strongly on a very heartfelt Trotskyite view, that it's kind of nice to see Trotsky coming back in their books so strongly. Now, what's interesting about the group, which I really like, and one thing that it does that we don't do nearly enough of, it's collective. They have 7 people, they work together, they really talk intensively, they expand beyond what any one of them can know. We're far behind where we should be in collective work, I think. This is both a politics and it's an intellectual opportunity that we need to be embracing much, much more. We're far behind the social sciences generally in this. At the same time, what's odd is that they have not completely escaped the problem of kind of small group dynamic, even group think. There's a kind of regression towards the interests of the dominant figures in the group, as far as I can see. So that, and they, despite the fact that they are comparative, since there are 7 of them, they stick entirely to English. So it's still within what comparatives have been often wondering about with post-colonial studies, which is this monolingualism. So they actually discuss Tayyip Saleh, A Season of Migration to the North, written, of course, in Arabic. Victor Pelevin, a Russian postmodernist, a Slovakian, Peter Pestanek, Spanish modernist, Pio Barreto, South African, Ivan Vladislavic, who writes in English, James Kelman from Glasgow. But they discuss all of them in English. Not once in the entire book do they cite a single work in the original language, neither any of the authors, not even a single work of criticism on any of them. So this seems to me something that's, oddly enough, although they're so anti-imperial in principle, they're totally within the imperialism of the Anglo-imperialism, linguistically that they reject in theory, politically. Symptomatic of this to me is that several of these people they discuss, Pestanek, Pio Barreto, Vladislavich, there are diacritics on their names. They always leave off the diacritics every time they refer to them. So you have critics without diacritics. So the materialism doesn't go to the materialism of language. Just to give one little example, this with Tayyip Saleh. They don't talk about Arabic, they don't talk about his own context. And they give a kind of one-sided reading of Season of Migration to the North, which they see as wholly opposed to imperial capitalism. They end with a kind of a Trotskyite fantasy in their reading at the end of Season of Migration to the North. You see the rural cadres inaugurating cooperative ventures and exercising local democracy once those engaged in socialized agrarian labor in the process of developing a class consciousness. End quote. That's what's happening there. What they don't even talk about is that Saleh is working for the BBC when he's writing this. He and his Scottish wife are on vacation in France when he starts the novel. He lives many years, they live many years in London and in Paris. He's working for UNESCO after the BBC. And he's very much engaged with a very complicated world, global institutions of various sorts. His book is referencing Conrad, Shakespeare, and Freud as much as Marx. And it's also referencing a whole range of Arabic writers, both from the Thousand and One Nights to Mahmoud Darwish and other modern Arabic poets, none of whom the work people can or try to read. So I think we need to think more capaciously about these dynamics and about these contexts. And in the case of work, we need to watch out for this, because we all have to make selections. We're not going to have reading Dante with 103 world figures. what are we going to do if we don't want to do a pure distant reading? We have to make selections. And so what I think we have to really try to do is to push against our own will to power over our material, and not only select those works that will ventriloquize what we already thought before we started reading, and not also read so selectively that that's all we get from the work. So I think, for example, they just dismiss out of hand the best book on Tayyib Saleh is by, I think, by Wael Hassan, president of the American Complet Association, a Bakhtinian reading. They just dismiss it in a phrase. And so I think it'd be more interesting to look at Saleh, for example, in relation to Laila Abu Layla, to take that amazingly interesting Scottish-Sudanese Muslim writer, the translator, which has an epigraph from Tayyib Saleh in it. But in an interview, she says, well, she didn't really like Season of Migration to the North because of all the male violence. What she really likes is his book, The Wedding of Zayn, and that's the one that resembles to her the Sudan that she grew up in. This is a book they don't, of course, even mention, because it's comic, it's different. And Abu Layla is herself not only a woman who doesn't like the male violence and doesn't think that's so much her Sudan, but she's also a believing Muslim. And of course, the deeply secularist post-colonialists of the work group, you will not find that there is a writer worth mentioning who has any religious belief anywhere, of course, in their book. So those are the sort of my initial responses in favor of kind of pluralism and critically engaged, and also watching out for how we're pre-shaping our materials to limit our results to what we already wanted to find. I think any scientific activity has to watch for that. And I think my brief for world literature in this respect is that we're forced to do it consciously, which is good. If you're working in a more defined national sphere, maybe you're not even realizing this pre-selection has been done for you by canonical forces. We're having to create our own canons or archives for every purpose. It's a lot of work. If you do it well, then it's really expanding the horizon as opposed to just confirming what you knew. And I think that there's a lot to be said for looking beyond and looking for people, particularly not things that are not relevant to what you want to do, but would push beyond the boundaries of where you are so far. So I was thinking about this in relation, for example, to Benedict Anderson's wonderful book, Imagined Communities, where he talks a lot about Thailand. And I thought, well, if only he'd had Kukri Pramod, that would have actually opened this out a little bit in an interesting way. He never mentions Pramod, who is, if not the most important 20th century Thai writer, certainly among them, and an extremely interesting figure for Benedict Anderson. Pramod was educated in Oxford, comes back home, founds a newspaper, and becomes a novelist and a playwright and an essayist and a historian. So it's exactly the imagined community at the nexus of print culture, journalism, and novel writing. And he is anti-Orientalist. His first book that he wrote with his brother was generated by his annoyance at Anna and the King of Siam, the movie from 1946, with Irene Dunne and Rex Harrison as the king, Mongkok, who would be Rama IV. Of course, you wouldn't have an actual, no Thai people were harmed in the making of this Hollywood film, of course, right? A deeply, fantastic Oriental fantasia. It becomes then the musical and later film The King and I, you may know it in that version. So he and his brother, in 1948, write this book, The King of Siam Speaks, trying to go back to that reign of Rama IV and what was actually going on. Give you a sense of this real person, not this autocrat who burns women alive and stuff that sadly Mongkok does in the movie. So he's a great figure in all his respects, and even wilder, it goes on. He then appeared in the film of The Ugly American with Marlon Brando as the king of an imaginary Siam-like country, as a prime minister of an imaginary Siam-like country. He then, 15 years later, became prime minister of Siam. So, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is perfect, right, in so many ways. But now, so why does he not appear? Whereas, let's say, Pramayadya Anantathur appears several times in Imagined Communities, very important Indonesian novelist, but of equal importance, and possibly Pramod would be even better. And I just have to think, and Anderson's working a lot with Siam, with the Thai situation, but the thing is, Tor has made it into the post-colonial sphere because his politics are congenial. Unfortunately, and he's a leftist, unfortunately, Pramod was a royalist. He was from an aristocratic background. He works for the royal family. So it doesn't fit, but that actually makes it more interesting to bring him into the discussion because you get something different. That he was a royalist, he was also a satire of the situation. He was satirizing from within. You might compare him more to, say, Voltaire, a kind of Voltairean figure within the aristocrat, but satirizing it. He's also a kind of feminist, a proto-feminist, as a means of showing how Thai society adjusts to life in modern society. He began a series of stories in 1953 on the life and times of his heroine, Mai Ploi, who as a young girl enters the service of Rama V, that's Chulalongkorn, lives on through the reign of Rama VIII, dying on the same day he dies. And these were later collected and translated as Four Reigns. Really interesting, excellent novel, really important novel, available in a good translation in English, never discussed by anybody. But on all kinds of reasons, this would be like tailor-made for all sorts of discussions today. And also, even in the world now today of world literature, he turns out to be interesting because he's not only is he Thai, he's a promoter of Thai culture, Thai dance, also Oxford educated. He also wrote a play called Rashomon, based on the Akutagawa and Kurosawa stories. He's a global figure, he's a world literature figure, and prime minister, and actor with Marlon Brando. What's not to like? And I think you'll see this summer great examples from Paul Bandia, Paul Giles in the second half, Bruce, everybody really thinking about how to move the post-colonial discourse, the global discourse, together in creative new ways. So now, let me now come to my three critiques that I would advance myself of the field. First is language. On language and form, it isn't only novels. So much of the discussion these days is on novels. I love novels, I often write about novels. There's a lot of other kinds of literature. And we see the problem, say, with Franco's work by confining himself to novels rather than, say, lyric. It's a different world. It's nothing wrong with it, but it limits the database. And particularly if you're interested in untranslatability, then poetry becomes doubly interesting because it's so much more challenging to translate, no question about it. And I think we need to give the example of poetry, we can't just say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to talk about poetry, particularly if you're going just beyond Anglophone or Francophone or a couple of other kinds of widespread poetry. How do we deal with translation? And I think this is both a political and a scholarly and a linguistic matter all at once, or it should be. So let me give you an example of a very creative scholar. This is not a world literature scholar, but a scholar based in area studies, Frances Pritchett at Columbia University. She is an Urdu specialist, and in the late 1990s, she was starting a annotated edition of the Urdu ghazals of Ghalib, the greatest Urdu poet of the 19th century. And it's going to be in 3 volumes, the annotated edition. And then it probably would have sold, what, 400 or 500 copies to libraries. And then 9/11 happened. And she decided that this cosmopolitan, amazing poet is someone the world should see. So she did a website called A Desert Full of Roses, the Urdu ghazals of Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib. And this is an amazing thing because it brings these Urdu poems, you have them all, and you have them in Devanagari script, you have them in Urdu script, you have them in Romanization, you have them in translation, you have them in performance on the website, you have different performances of some of them, you have beautiful images. And she says this is the most engrossing scholarly project she's ever done. I talked to her some years ago, and it's fairly new. She was getting 10,000 hits a month from all over the world. If you Google Ghalib, just the name Ghalib, you'll get 475,000 hits. Here's number 4 on the first page. This is a scholarly project, and it's a labor of love, and it brings these ghazals to you in whatever script you want, and potentially in any language that you want. So this is as a scholarly project, and I think also in terms of as a pedagogical project, we have the problem you have to use translations pretty much, at least in introductory survey course. And when we did the World Literature Anthology for Longman, for which Bruce was one of our 19th century co-editors. We really wanted Gottlieb to have an important pride of place there in the 19th century. He's such a brilliant poet. And we had to figure out how to get people to read and teach him. So one problem was context, and one problem was language. The problem of context, I think we each came up with a solution. The problem of context, Bruce invented a category called the national poet. I believe it was invented in the 19th century, but Bruce thought, this is what we need. So we had a whole section of national poets, and Gottlieb goes with Pushkin, and goes with Whitman, and goes with Dionysius Solomos, and a whole bunch of people. So it became a way to think. If you never heard of Gottlieb, you think, well, I know what a national poet, let's think about it that way, the court poet of the Mughals. The linguistic side, the problem is he writes these ghazals, which are these haunting couplets that all have to end with the same rhyme, and you can't translate all those rhyming couplets and make a beautiful poem in English, so people give up and just translate without the rhyme, and it loses then half the pleasure of the verse, which is how will they get to the rhyme? How will they get from that in the next couplet? So what my little idea with this was to take Agha Shahid Ali, Kashmir American poet, devotee of Gottlieb, whom we translated, and a devotee of the ghazal. And Shahid Ali wrote a lot of ghazals in English. So if you read his ghazals in English, you can actually get the effect. So we put some of his English ghazals in the 19th century volume next to Gottlieb. So you can see, now you can see what it's like. Could you read Urdu or Persian? This is what you would get by reading Shahid Ali, because you're not having to read it. So it is a translation that's not in a translation. And if you then start to think about Shahid Ali, a lot of his poems are about issues of language and culture. So it can be done. It takes activism, it takes creativity. It's a political, intellectual, and pedagogical process all at once. My second critique, it has to do with context. World literature isn't only modern. There's been so much attention to the last 100 years, last 50 years. So many of the current books largely focus on that. Of course, it's where we're living. It's very interesting, but that's only the last 1% of the history of writing, of literacy, 5,000 years. And I want to occupy world literature on behalf of the 99%, not just the 1%, right? Or the 2%, the 3%, which is mostly what we're discussing, as good as that is. And just to say, world literature has always had a world aspect from the very get-go. The very first patron of literature that I know about was King Shulgi of Ur, who reigned from 2097 to 2047 BCE. I sometimes say that most of my work is between about 2000 and 2010. It's just 2000 BCE. But here this is a prose translation of a poem, and he's already imagining this poem he's commissioned, if he hasn't written it himself, that his work will circulate in distant times and languages. Now I swear by the sun god Utu on this very day, and my younger brothers shall be witness of it in foreign lands where the sons of Sumer are not known, where people don't have the use of paved roads, you poor primitives out there in Europe, where they have no access to the written word, you poor fish, which is like everywhere in the world. We're the only people who know how to write, except those Egyptians, I want to mention them, right? That I, the firstborn son, am a fashioner of words, a composer of songs, a composer of words, and that they will recite my songs as heavenly writings. They will bow down before my words. So this is like hyper-canonicity before there's any literature. And he praises himself for being able to speak in 5 languages. So already it's a multilingual world out of which the very first poetry is being written 4,100 years ago. So it was always there. At the same time, he's creating one of the first early empires in southern Sumer. So it's an imperial project. It's also a worldly project. It's a highly political project that is well worth our exploration. Finally, on politics. I think the problem with our politics is it's not nearly global enough. It is recognized, as Franco Moretti well says, you may say it's one, but it's unequal. But I think we're not doing nearly enough to reach unequal parts of the playing field. Georg Brandes already theorized this in 1899 in his book, he's best known for his book, The Hovedströmninger, the major currents, another ocean metaphor of 19th century literature. But in his essay on world literature in 1899, he says it's incontestable that writers of different countries and languages occupy enormously different positions where the chances of obtaining worldwide fame or even a moderate degree of recognition are concerned. The most favorably situated are the French writers, though the French language occupies only the 5th rank in terms of how many people speak it. When a writer succeeded in France, he's known throughout the world. English and Germans, who can count on an immense public if they're successful, take second place. It's only writers from these three nations who can hope to be read in the original by the most educated people of all nations. And English, French, and German were the classic complete languages when certainly I was a student. Italian and Spanish writers are less fortunate, though they may be read by a significant number of readers outside their native lands. But whoever writes in Finnish, Hungarian, Swedish, Danish, Dutch, Greek, or the like is obviously poorly placed in the universal struggle for fame. In this competition, he lacks a major weapon, again, the military language, a language which is, for a writer, almost everything. 10 years ago, for one of the complete reports, I did a little graph on canonicity and major and minor hyper-canonical writers, and noting that this tendency towards the rich getting richer was happening everywhere in literature, including in post-colonial studies. Just for this talk, I just had to update, do a new version of the graph. For the last 10 years, it has not gotten really any better. So what you see is, if you say kind of major writers that you might have, I'm thinking like you have the upper middle class and lower middle class. There's upper major writers and lower major writers. But then there are these, the 1%, the hyper-canonical writers. James Joyce, this is a number of citations by subject, MLA, in the last 10 years. 2,302 for James Joyce, 1,705 for Virginia Woolf, 1,197 for Kafka, 1,075 for Borges, 997 for Proust. All the people I just happened to look at, you'll notice is all the powerful Western European languages here. You then get the upper majors, so Rushdie, 451, he's sort of the hyper-canon within post-colonial studies. Garcia Marquez almost as good. Bolaño has come very strong at the moment. Marguerite Duras. Liu Xun is very interesting. So with Chinese, he's there at the low end of what you may call the upper major. Of course, in China, I mean, he should be here, but in the whatever, and MLA is not only English, but what they note, Liu Xun is down there, borderline there. And then you kind of lower major, Pamuk, Clarice Lispector, Tagore, Perec is there, Mahfouz, Murakami. So notice the non-European languages are there with a writer of French who is of sort of the third extension, as Brandes was, right? I mean, Perec is great, but he's there along with Mahfouz, Nobel Prize winner, Tagore, Lispector, most important Brazilian woman writer ever, right? But because he's French, he gets to be there. Then you have the kind of minor writers, Premchand, and he's even borderline, Asturias, Guatemalan writer, a major language but a minor country, again Nobel Prize, Knut Hamsun, Eileen Chang, and these are under 100, so over 10 years, just a few a year. And then you get these ultra minor, what I'm starting to think about, just a couple a year, and here's Pramod, 1 in the last 10 years, and it's 5 fucking pages. That's it. Multatuli, whom Bruce is interested, only 11. Again, it's a European country, but only 1 a year. Iguchi Chiyo, a very important Meiji writer. Ghalib, our friend Ghalib here, again, sort of ultra minor, and Premchand where you are. So we haven't even begun to do justice to the importance of these writers, getting them into the world literature discourse. And let me just emphasize that this is not just the non-Western writers, it's equally the Western writers in the smaller countries. And a quick example, as I come towards a close, I just read the 5th volume in translation of Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle. This is the volume where he's talking about being a young in writing school in Bergen around 1990. We were nobodies, he said, 2 young lit students chatting away in a rickety old house in a small town at the edge of the world. That's how you feel in Bergen, especially in the winter, which lasts 12 months a year, 11 months a year. A place where nothing of any significance had ever happened and presumably never would. But what we read was not nothing. It concerned matters of the utmost significance. It was written by the greatest thinkers and writers in Western culture, and that was basically a miracle. And now what's really interesting, I did a quick scan through the volume. I'm sure I missed something, but here are the writers he mentions by name. So the world literature writers, Claude Simon, Rob Gay, Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, Genet, Tolkien, Bret Easton Ellis, John Irving, Rimbaud, Trakel, Bachmann, Proust. His world literature circle 1990 is basically major European countries plus the United States in those 3 or 4 languages, those were mentioned. And but he has also a lot of Scandinavian writers. And what was really sobering to me was, and maybe you're about, how many of these people do you recognize the name? All of these people I've either read, or at least I know the name. These people, I know Knut Hamsun, I've read him. That's the only one, I'm sorry to say. I have never read Øystein Lød, Ole Robert Sunde, Jan Kjærstad, Sabia Christensen, Jan Fosse, Ragnar Hovland, Ralf Sagen, Kjartan Flögstad, Tor Ulven, Merete Morgan Andersen, Henrik Wergeland, Herman Wildende, Eller Einan, Gunnar Ekelöf, or Tarjei Vesaas, who is the most important Norwegian writer of the second half of the 20th century, according to Wikipedia. I don't know the name. Right? So somehow we need to do this better. This is a challenge to all of us. Let me just end in closing just with a couple of ghazals by Shahid Ali on the sort of sum up the problem. Oh, I just want to say, in the Journal of World Literature, our new journal, of which we are associate members, and we're doing an issue every year, we're just now, and this is a plea, we're doing an issue for next year called Ultra Minor Literatures, a project developed by one of our participants as a postdoc in Hong Kong, Børge Morberg, from Copenhagen, and we're looking for entries. If you're interested in ultra minor literature, however you want to define it, we want to hear from you. And let me just close with a couple of ghazals by Shahid Ali, just on these problems of language and context. And this is about translating the untranslatable, contextualizing the uncontextualizable in language. First ghazal, Beyond English. How do we get beyond English within English is very much, I think, our project here. No language is old or young beyond English. So what of a common tongue beyond English? I know some words for war, all of them sharp, but the sharpest one is jung, beyond English. If you wish to know of a king who loved his slave, you must learn legends, often sung, beyond English. Baghdad is sacked, and the citizens must watch prisoners now in miniatures, very ironic, hung beyond English. Go all the way through jungle from Aleph to Zenith to see English like monkeys swung beyond English. Here we get John Donne, so never seek to know, send to know for whom the bell tolled, for across the earth it is rung beyond English. If you want your drugs legal, you must leave the States, not just for hashish, but for one bung beyond English. Heartbroken, I tottered out into windless snow, snowflakes on my lips, silence stung beyond English. When the phrase, the mother of all battles, caught on, the surprise was indeed not sprung beyond English. Could a soul crawl away at last unshriveled, which to its own fusing senses had clung beyond English? If someone asks where Shahid has disappeared, he's waging a war, no jung beyond English. This was published in 2001 posthumously. He died of a brain tumor at the young age of about 52. And when he has disappeared, the last ghazal is a two-line ghazal in this last volume called Existed. If you leave, who will prove that my cry existed? Tell me, what was I like before I existed? It's such a brilliant poem, because who is you and who is I? If it's Ghalib, you know, it could be God, or it could be the beloved. Is you us speaking to Shahid Ali if you leave? Is it Shahid Ali speaking to us if we, the reader, leave? I also like to think it's the poem. It's the poet itself speaking to Shahid. Don't leave. So we have a lot to discuss. We have a lot of challenges before us, and I welcome you to 4 weeks of intensely engaging with the world in this locale. Thank you very much. We have a little time if people want to give me a hard time about something or press further.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. One question. We're always discussing, broadening the canon of literary texts that we study in world literature. And my question has to do with the canon of theoretical texts that take part in shaping and defining and redefining our field of study. And I was wondering, you've shown us the
Absolutely. Let me use this opportunity to beat up on Emily Apter a little bit more. So, you know, she does use Edouard Glissant, which is good, as a number of people do, very important thinker, who's Caribbean, though still very, very Francophone. She has one writer from the Arab world who's Khalito, and Khalito she uses, he has a book written in Arabic that she reads in translation called Thou Shalt Not Speak My Language. And she uses him as a sort of example of, look, if we go outside, we see the problem of translatability. She doesn't, however, talk about his more recent book, Je parle toutes les langues mais en arabe, which takes the opposite view, that Arabic is the world language in which you have every language. And she doesn't pause to note that Khalito himself was educated at Sorbonne, writes most of his criticism in French, is very much in the Francophone world. So I think it is entirely an important project of ours. And it means everything from Sanskrit aesthetics. Sheldon Pollock has been doing amazing work on this and has just published an amazing, fantastic compendium in English of Sanskrit aesthetic works over the millennia, extremely important. Two works, theoretical works in minor languages. A few years ago at an ACLA meeting, I had a thing on comparative world literatures or world literature and theory. And one of the sessions, one of the papers was by a graduate student at Michigan who had been working on Yiddish world literature. And Saul Zarat is here, who knows well this material. In the 1930s, these Yiddish writers are theorizing Yiddish Weltliteratur with a V rather than a W. And talking about what does it mean to have a world literature when you don't have a nation, to be spread around the world, and they theorize. And so in the Blackwell anthology that I did on theories of world literature, I got this graduate student to translate from Yiddish two of these essays. So it means an activist job of translating. You have to find these works that are really interesting, and they can be from surprising places. And I think there's a huge amount of work for us to do there.
Thank you very much for your eagerness, very meaningful and informative lectures in relation to world literature and its development. These are not questions here on some sort of educational reasons, as I'm interested in world literature. Once, world literature was a one-way traffic, but nowadays, it is becoming many-way traffic, for example, coming from all directions. Of course, this coming moving and not symmetric. And theorists are actually would like to theorize this uprising or upheaval of literature in many ways, historically, temporally, and spatially, synchronically, diachronically, syntagmatically, paradigmatically. It's becoming a sort of volatile situation. As a leader, sometimes we are at bay. Is it possible to come up with a theoretical approach that can at least not guarantee so that we can tackle this situation? And if it is not possible, then what is the solution? Supplementary questions you can say nowadays when, for example, if someone would like to get a place in comparative literature at Harvard University, for example, he or she has to know.
Ask Deanna. Give us a line.
Beyond one language, you can say, other than his first language, he has to know two languages. And in one language, he or she has to have a reading knowledge, you can say. Yeah, it happens. I'm not pessimistic, you can say. But taking the word for some time of the death of the discipline, for example, one reason happens that you have already established Institute for World Literature. But it happens within 10 to 15 years, you can say. As world literature is becoming very powerful, day by day, you can say, you will open the Department of World Literature. That would it be possible to part of the student to study world literature in one language, or they have to learn it with more than one language, like comparative literature?
I think it's several very important questions worked in here. I think that comparative literature departments are still justifying their existence partly in terms of multilingualism and that importance of knowing 3 or 4 languages, and we still like to stress that. When we reshaped our program here a few years ago, we decided the name of the discipline is comparative literature. We still want to keep that. We believe in comparison as something, and that I think world literature can well be done from within an English department or a Swahili department, or an area studies department, or a comparative literature department. So it really does cut across these things. In fact, one of my big emphases these days is that there's not another thing world literature is not is the opposite of national literature. On one, I think kind of a figure ground reversal, that on the one hand, world literature could be seen as the outer frame within which are the nations, but we only experience world literature within our own national situation. So you can study the world literature of your nation perfectly well, and a lot of work I think is quite interesting to do that, particularly if you take into account that translation becomes part of a national tradition if it's influential, and that no nation is monolingual to begin with. So you have multilingual writing in a nation. I also think in terms of language, I'm increasingly thinking though with, say, comparative literature, that we can move beyond the model from my own upbringing, which is you should sort of try to one-up the national specialists and try to have as good an accent as they have in 3 languages, and that's what you do. And you do only the languages in which you can say, look, I know that. I think we need a sliding scale of linguistic competence. Much better to know 6 languages at different levels, maybe 1 really, really well, but then the others you have a use value of different. That's at least my own case. And I think it's very useful. So I think this language thing can be dealt with partly by that, and partly by much more collaborative work than we've done. That's, I think, the other thing we're really lagging on.
If the name of the discipline is still comparative literature, then what sort of thing is world literature if not a discipline?
It can be, and there are now some programs in world literature. Simon Fraser decided, they set up a new program a few years ago, and it's an undergraduate institution in a working class suburb of Vancouver, and they said comparative literature sounded too upper class continental stuff, and they did world literature, and they said, look, we're about the world. We have people from 100 countries in this neighborhood, and they're thriving. They're hiring people, and they're hiring people with specific for a lot like Arabic and Turkish. They're not just hiring people to do everything, they're hiring people to do different parts of the world and putting them together. So there are such programs, and I think it's great that there are, and it's really good that there is like the journal now, and there should be more such projects. But I also think that world literature doesn't need to be thought of exclusively as a discipline. It's really a perspective that can be done from within a variety of disciplinary formations, I think. So in that sense, it's a body of material, it's a set of research questions, and then there are disciplines. And disciplines, of course, it can be disciplines in terms of sociology, economics, linguistics, and then national configurations or area studies or comparative, and the occasional actual world literature program.
In reference to your, when you referred to Scandinavian writers, you said we need to do this better. I was just wondering if you meant to read more, or if you could expand on that. Thank you.
That's a great question. A real hero for me is Georg Brandes. He really thought hard about this in the Scandinavian context. And he talks a lot about, he was very interested in trying to cosmopolitanize, I suppose, the Scandinavian countries. He felt they were very provincial, and also to promote Scandinavian literature. And he decided, well, you know, no one's going to have time to read my 100 favorite Scandinavian writers outside of Scandinavia. So he put his money on Ibsen and on Kierkegaard, and he really pushed them hard. And thanks to him, William Archer is translating Ibsen, very good translation early. Thanks to him, James Joyce encounters this, learns Norwegian in order to read Ibsen better, writing Ibsen a letter on his 70th birthday saying, well, you're about to die, but I'm here now. And that's really because Brandes thought, all right, I'm going to put my money on the 2 writers I think have the widest appeal at the moment. And I think that's, all of us have the opportunity, the challenge to do that. You know, of the 20 people we might know, the 100 people we might wish people are reading. So today I'm putting some money on Pamot because I got interested in him lately. I think he's quite fascinating, and I can see why a lot of people might find something in him. So this is the kind of person that we can promote. All those people that Karl Ove Knausgaard was reading, I'm not going to read all of them, but I feel bad that I don't know the most important one, who's very important to him, you know, and we should be able to do better with that. It also means, I think, that, like right now, I would push my own department. We have a language requirement we opened up to say you do 2 or 3 languages, and one of them has to be a cross-cultural or cross-temporal language, so like ancient or a different part of the world. I would like to say one of them, that's fine, it could be, but how about if one of them is just a less studied language? Norwegian to me is absolutely as good as, you know, Sanskrit, for the purpose of widening the field. We need more of these things here.
There's more question about the program and about the lecture. I was wondering about the possibility of translation sessions at the seminar, since there's obviously a lot of languages in the room. And I'm coming back from the Transatlantic World Women Seminar just 2 weeks ago, where these translation sessions exist, led by translators, obviously on base text that is in English, so accessible to everyone. But in the room were translations of women to Taiwanese, Swedish, Hebrew, German, Italian, and Portuguese, and that was just a session that I participated in. So would it be a possibility to have something similar here, where base texts are chosen each year, sent out to students beforehand in preparation, getting together? Because these sessions are incredibly fruitful in the results that they produce, in how you see it. Well, what is difficult with one language? What is not
Dana, thank you so much.
with the next one?
No, I think it's a great idea, especially the idea of some setup preparation in advance, because we haven't done that. Of course, we have a lot of work on translation happening here. Several people doing who identify very strong in translation studies, and at least 1 or 2 of the colloquia are probably translation oriented. Two of them are translation oriented. So even within this year, it should be possible in one of those venues to promote that. But I love the idea of also setting it in advance and circulating some text and saying, bring in some translations. I think that's a great idea. There's a great project called Worlding Say Shonagon, a book that was published a couple years ago by a Canadian translation specialist, Valerie Hennetuk, and she has 30 or 35 different translations of the opening of the Pillow Book of Say Shonagon, a couple of passages, in all these different languages within an English translation of that translation. And as a kind of a pedagogical tool, it's exactly doing that and collecting these things. So that's also a scholarly way of doing that. So let's see what you can do with the colloquia we have now, and let's think about it for next year. It's a great suggestion. No, I think it's very important, and I think it means looking at all kinds of possibilities. I think there are all sorts of openings now to really pursue, and I really admire Frances Pritchett. She just built a little website and did it, you know. Now she it took her time, so no one was paying her, so that's a problem. But that's something we can do, you know, CLC Web, and there are more journals like this, and like. In this case, we're always having essays by graduate students as well as faculty in our journal. So I think you need to do that. But then also, you know, even websites, even thinking of translation projects. One thing I think that's nice, when I was a student, the assumption was you wouldn't really do translations. If you did on the side, maybe, but sort of hide it. I think what we now see people actually doing, both as graduate students and as young faculty members, doing translation, getting awards for translation, getting grants for translation. And I think there's a more openness in the field now to crediting translation as a worthwhile scholarly activity. So it's a better time for it now than it used to be.